See my slides?
Looks good.
Okay. Thanks, Boris. Thanks, everyone. And also thanks for this opportunity. I wanted to share our recent efforts on the uncertainty reduction. And a major component of this uncertainty reduction framework is that it's different from the traditional way that we calibrate the model or analyze the model structure. We wanted to see that how much we can leverage on the machine learning and the causal network, and how can we decompose the uncertainty and sequentially reduce that, and given a large number of land model simulations. So I wanted to start with this conceptual framework that we start from the process-based model that coded those detailed biogeochemical processes, hydrological processes, and then normally we have some parameters, critical parameters, and we adjust those parameters to make sure, at least during a historical condition, that we are matching those benchmark, so those observations or those perturbation experiments. And sometimes we also measure the functional relationships, see if that's consistent. And then for the Rubisco project wise thinking is that we do a lot of work on the model benchmarking, data sets development, and also we have a lot of performance metrics to evaluate different aspects of the model. But there is relatively less efforts on the model improvement part, which I think is an important component of this conceptual framework, to be able to continuously improve the process-based model. We want this whole cycle can really work together. So after the metrics or the performance skills that we evaluate, we want to also look into the model improvement part in terms of improving the structure, or at least telling how much uncertainty is coming from the model structure, and see if it's possible to do some parameterization to improve the model. And also the input variables, sometimes they are biased. For example, the climate forcing, and see how much uncertainty is coming from that part. And so with this model improvement gets down, then we can go back to the process-based model and see how much improvement we can actually do at process base. Then the whole cycle will just work very effectively. And so the challenge here really is then how to quantify the land model uncertainty. Particularly, you want to isolate those three major components of uncertainty: input variables, parameterization, and structure. And particularly for structure, it's very difficult because structure emerge at different level, at equation level, at process level, at system level, subsystem level. So it's relatively more more difficult than the input variable and parameterization. And we wanted to reduce the land model without rerunning those models. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. We just use a computational time to exchange for a better model. So we wanted to see if we can do that with machine learning and also the causal network analysis. So zooming into different sources of uncertainty here, we look into the input variables. So basically a traditional way of doing that is that we drive model, or we rerun a model with different forcing. Here is example from Dave Lawrence paper, and they force the model with different kinds of sourcing and conclude that the land model can perform better with more accurate forcing, which is GSWP3 V1 version. And the idea here is that if we have multiple input variables, input forcing, multiple sets, and then we just rerun the model and then evaluate it. And we can also evaluate the accuracy of the forcing. Here in the bottom, there are forcing scores. And if it's not good, then we can maybe do some bias correction for the forcing first, and then go back and rerun the model. And in this way, then we can know how much uncertainty actually is generated by this uncertainty in the input variables. But again, we need to rerun the model, which is not what we want in this framework. And the second component is parameterization. So here's an example for the McLeish-Manton type of equation that we have two critical parameters, Vmax and Km, that basically adjust the shape of this uptake rate. And here is an example for tuning exercise of those critical parameters related to the Vmax and Km at tropical sites for nutrient uptake and plant productivity. So you can see here the blue bars, or the histogram of the blue area, is the prior distribution that we sample from, and the red bars, they are the posterior. And we can readily see that if we do this, if we rerun a large number of model simulation, we are able to get a relatively tight distribution of the posterior parameters. And so we call that those optimized parameters. And we use those optimized parameters to run the future simulation or run large scale simulation. So this is the whole idea of how we get rid of uncertainty from parameterization. And the third is a structure. It's more difficult. But here's an example that we can look at the structure at system level and to define the interaction of different component or different variable within this system and see how they interact with each other, and also the direction of the interaction and the strength of the interaction, and also including time lag. So some variable may instantaneously affect others, but some variable may have some time lags. So with this transfer entropy analysis here, the Benrado published in 2009. They basically have a very good framework to reconstruct this process network, and we can use that for the land surface model as well, as long as we have those variables. This is an example for observations, and we do the test for CMIP models. And here we wanted to look at the process interaction, or the structure interaction of the interaction between sea surface temperature, LAI, and the local precipitation. So we do that for CMIP-5 models. And here is the process network that we identified. A unidirectional impacts of sea surface temperature on the Northern African precipitation. And there is an internal cycle between LAI and precipitation stress. And on the right, we can readily identify the uncertainty from the model structure comparing with the observation that is on the right. So with this, then we can confidently say, okay, this transfer entropy analysis can really help us to understand how much uncertainty within each model, and they're different, we can see across models. And the question will be then, how can we use those information to improve the model? So I will give two examples here. Two case study. One is to reduce the uncertainty of CMIP-6 model simulations of land surface energy partitioning. A little bit background about the energy partitioning is that when we have net radiation come in, it dissipates through two pathways, latent heat and sensible heat fluxes. And there's one critical variable called evaporative fraction, which is the latent heat divided by the total latent and sensible heat. It's an important indicator of land atmosphere interactions and through which energy pathway. And so we look at the CMIP-6 models at 64 FluxNet sites and found that the model EF, evaporative fraction, is much higher than the observed EF on the right. So we ask how much how much uncertainty came from input variables and how much uncertainty come from parameterization, and possibly how uncertain is in terms of the model structure. So here's a technical approach. First, we surrogate those CMIP-6 model because we don't want to rerun those model. And so we use machine learning to just, for each different individual model, we have a machine learning version of that model and training with the CMIP-6 input variables and CMIP-6 output EF, evaporative fraction. And on the bottom left is just to verify the performance of this surrogate model, make sure it really reproduces the model EF, or the relationship between inputs and the EF. And then we plot out a scatter plot of observed EF and the surrogate model EF. Again, we see it biasly, so we have high overestimate EF, and which is consistent with the original version that the CMIP model generated. And here, then we can now replace the CMIP-6 input variable, the temperature, precipitation, with observations from FluxNet. Then with that, we can effectively improve the performance. We can see on the right, the scatter plot. Again, comparing observed EF and the surrogate model, simulated EF, but with forcing by the observational input variables. And there are just a metric for the performance improved from 0.47 to 0.66, which is pretty good. Then we can ask how much uncertainty we can reduce in terms of parameterization. So here are some caveats. We tune the model or the surrogate model and then do some fine tune, but the fine tune has a limited number of tuning steps. So make sure the model didn't get out, still has some features that inherit from our pre-trained surrogate model, but try to match the observed EF with some limited parameterization efforts. And with this, we can infer how much the potential of uncertainty reduction if we tune the physical model offline. And so here, if we do that, we can see again a scatter plot comparing observed and model EF. We can see the R improve from 0.66 to 0.8. And on the right, we can see across different plan functional type, they are totally different. And we want to know the reason why. Here, one of the important features is that over tropical evergreen broadleaf forest, the fine tune doesn't work that well compared with other plan functional types. So why that happened? And here we look into the model structure that emerged at this process level, and then look at the structure similarity between model and observation. So here we have a heat map in the bottom. Higher number means higher similarity compared with the observed process network. And we can see the EBF, the evergreen broadleaf forest, the tropical ecosystem, has the smallest similarity, which really prevent the model being fine-tuned towards the observed EF. And so we can see here a strong interaction that, or some implications for our model development, that we have to first know which part of the model has the largest structural uncertainty, and then we have to improve the structural uncertainty first. Otherwise, the tuning doesn't work, just as demonstrated here with this machine learning approach. But the caveat is that the structure here is emerged at the time scale of the model outputs, and also the process level that those variables at the model outputs. So if you really want to get into the detail of the model structure, we need to output more high frequency output variables, including those internal variables, so that we can really reconstruct the whole structure. Rather than here, we just have some temperature, those climate forcing, LAI, GPP, and also the EF. It gives us a broad picture, but not very detailed. So I think we can do a better job if we have more detailed model outputs and then compare with the observation. So this is the first case. And then second case, we ask, can we actually use those network or the causal structure to reduce the model future projection uncertainties? So the second case is about California precipitation. And here are CMIP6 model projections, the precipitation change under the high emission scenario. And we divide into northern and central southern parts because the dominant source of precipitation and the mechanisms are totally different. And here we can see, this is just CMIP6 raw outputs. We can see a huge range of precipitation change from negative 30% to positive 49%. So that means that with that high range of precipitation change, that totally doesn't useless for example, the policy mitigation planning, because we don't even know the sign of the precipitation change. So the question here is, how can we confidently reduce the uncertainty range for the future projection? So the idea here, we make this assumption that if we see a causal structure or emergent structure from the observation for the historical period. And we also see that in the model. And plus, we also see that structure conserved in the future. Then we can use that causal structure to confidently reduce the future projection uncertainty. So here is the example between California precipitation, the causal structure between California precipitation and with some remote oceanic regions, those different nodes. And the highlighted nodes there has more influence on the California precipitation, either directly or indirectly. So the actual structure is more complicated than I show here. So there are substructure within this directional control. But at least here we can easily check the observation is the red box highlighted heat map. Compare with different models, we can see some model they totally miss those connection or causal structure, and some model they're doing better. But most model saying this pattern, the observed pattern, will conserve or will be persistent in the future. And then we use this information to kind of constrain the model feature projection, saying, okay, which models are more confident at which level. And then here we can reduce about 70% of uncertainty in terms of the projection uncertainty. And we can confidently say that the California is going to getting wetter, at least based on this causal structure constraint for both northern and the central southern parts. And this constraint is totally based on the physical mechanism, because the physical mechanism, meaning for example, here node 22, its impact on the California precipitation, maybe that's the high pressure blocking mechanism that really influence the California precipitation. So we can really, we can rely on those mechanisms and then see how much uncertainty we can reduce. And so to summarize these two work, that we actually have a uncertainty reduction framework that combine machine learning and causal network analysis that we can use to constrain multi-model projection, or even if we have one model but we have different realization that also can work, we can reduce the uncertainty during the historical period, but also we can also constrain the future projections. And here I wanted to highlight this emergent structure that either is teleconnection structure or it's localized emergent structure for the system organization that we can all use them as a powerful constraint for the uncertainty reduction or the constraint of future projection. So that's what I wanted to share today. Thanks, everyone.